The cold wind of the north howled louder than ever before, but this time it carried something different, not just fear, but change. Jon Snow stood at the edge of the wall, his black cloak snapping violently behind him. His dark eyes scanned the endless white horizon beyond, where death itself had once marched. But now something else stirred there, something alive. He was no longer just a bastard of Winterfell, no longer just the Lord Commander, and no longer just a king. He was something the North had never seen before, a unifier. Behind him stood warriors who once would have killed each other without hesitation. The Night's Watch, the Free Folk, Northern Lords, and even a handful of Southern soldiers, all standing together under one purpose. It wasn't loyalty that bound them. It was survival. And Jon knew survival alone would not be enough anymore. "Are you certain about this?" a rough voice asked behind him. Jon turned to see Tormund Giantsbane, his red beard covered in frost, eyes filled with both curiosity and doubt. Jon gave a slow nod. "We've fought them once, we barely survived, next time we won't." Tormund grunted. "So your answer is to trust dragons?" At that word, a deep rumble echoed across the sky. Both men looked up. 3 shadows moved through the grey clouds, massive, powerful, terrifying. The sound of wings beating against the cold air sent a shiver through every man below. The dragons had come north. Men shifted nervously, some gripped their weapons tighter, others whispered prayers. The free folk stared in awe, but even they knew these creatures were not just beasts, they were destruction made flesh. Jon didn't flinch. "Not trust," he said quietly, "control." The dragons descended slowly, snow swirling violently around them as they landed. Their massive bodies cracked the frozen ground, their eyes glowing with ancient intelligence. At the center of it all stood Daenerys Targaryen. She stepped forward, her silver hair flowing like a ghost in the wind, her expression calm, but her eyes sharp. She had not come north for friendship. She had come for power and perhaps something more dangerous. "Belief." "You called for dragons," she said, her voice steady, yet carrying across the frozen silence. "Now you have them." Jon walked toward her, every step deliberate. Around them, the North watched carefully. This was not just a meeting, it was a test. "You said you wanted to break the wheel," Jon replied, "but the North doesn't care about Southern thrones." Daenerys tilted her head slightly. "Then why am I here?" Jon stopped just a few steps away from her. His voice lowered, but somehow became stronger. "Because the real war isn't in the South, it's here, and if we fall, your throne won't matter." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then Daenerys smiled faintly, but it wasn't warmth, it was calculation. "And you think dragons will save you?" she asked. Jon shook his head slowly. "No, I think we will save each other." Her eyes narrowed. Around them, tension built like a storm about to break. Then suddenly, a horn echoed from the distance. Long, deep, terrifying. Every man froze. Tormund's face went pale. "That's not." Jon didn't wait. He turned sharply toward the north. Beyond the wall, something moved. Not just shadows this time. An army. But it wasn't the size that made Jon's blood run cold. It was what led them. A single figure, mounted on a dead horse, glowing blue eyes piercing through the storm. Night King had returned. And this time, he wasn't waiting. The ground trembled as thousands of undead marched forward in perfect silence. No war cries, no fear, just death advancing. Daenerys looked at the army, her confidence flickering for the first time. Even her dragons shifted uneasily, growling low in their throats. "This is what you meant," she whispered. Jon's voice hardened. "This is why you're here." Another horn blast. Closer now. The army of the dead wasn't days away. It was here. Jon turned to the gathered forces, the wildlings who once hated the wall, the northern lords who distrusted him, the Southern Queen who questioned him. "This is it," he shouted, his voice cutting through fear. "No more divisions, no more pride. We stand together or we die alone." Silence. Then slowly, Tormund raised his axe. "We fight," he growled. A northern lord followed. Then another. Steel rang as swords were drawn, shields lifted. Fear remained, but it was no longer alone. It had become something else. Resolve. Daenerys watched all of it, and then finally she spoke. "Then let it be known," she said, her voice rising as one of her dragons roared behind her, "that from this moment on the dragons, the North, and the free folk stand as one." Jon looked at her, not with trust, but with understanding. This alliance wasn't built on friendship. It was built on necessity. And necessity was far more dangerous. As the dead marched closer, Jon felt something deep inside him shift. This wasn't just a war anymore. This was the beginning of something the world had never seen before. A united force of fire and ice. And if they failed, there would be no one left to remember them. The air grew heavier with every passing second, like the world itself was holding its breath. Snow fell thicker now, swirling in chaotic patterns as if even the sky feared what was coming. Jon stood firm, but inside, his thoughts were racing faster than the storm. This was no longer about defending the wall. This was about rewriting everything people believed about enemies, loyalty, and power. The army of the dead continued its slow, unstoppable advance. Thousands, no, tens of thousands. Jon could see them clearly now, rotting faces, broken limbs still moving, hollow eyes glowing with that same unnatural blue. But what made his chest tighten wasn't just their number. It was their silence. No screams, no rage, just obedience. "They don't feel fear," someone whispered behind him. Jon didn't turn. "No," he said quietly, "but we do, and that's why we'll win." It sounded strong, but even he wasn't sure if he believed it. A deafening roar suddenly tore through the sky. "The dragons!" Drogon stepped forward first, his massive black wings spreading wide, casting a shadow over the entire battlefield. Regal and Viserion followed, their growls vibrating through the frozen ground. Their presence alone made men step back, unsure whether to feel protected or threatened. Daenerys walked toward them slowly, her hand brushing against Drogon's scales. There was a connection there, something deep, almost unnatural. Power recognized power. But Jon noticed something else. The dragons were uneasy. "They can feel it," he said under his breath. Tormund frowned. "Feel what?" Jon's eyes locked onto the distant figure of the Night King, him. As if responding to that very thought, the Night King raised his hand. And the dead stopped. Just like that. The entire army froze in place. A ripple of confusion spread through Jon's forces. Men shifted nervously, gripping their weapons tighter. Waiting was somehow worse than fighting. "What is he doing?" a northern soldier muttered. No one had an answer. Then the Night King slowly tilted his head and lifted one finger. At first, nothing happened. Then the ground beneath the battlefield began to shake. A low rumble echoed beneath their feet, snow cracked, ice split open like glass, and from beneath the frozen earth. Hands! Dead hands! They burst through the snow, clawing upward, dragging themselves out of shallow grave, old battlefields, forgotten corpses buried beneath years of ice. The North itself was betraying them. Men stumbled back in horror as freshly risen whites pulled themselves free, joining the army from behind their lines. "We are surrounded," someone screamed. Panic spread instantly. Jon's jaw clenched. This was worse than he expected. The Night King wasn't just attacking, he was breaking them from the inside. "Hold your ground," Jon shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Do not break." But fear had already taken root. A group of soldiers turned, trying to flee, but they didn't get far. The newly risen dead lunged at them, dragging them down into the snow. Tormund roared in anger, swinging his axe and crushing a white skull. "Fight, you cowards! They bleed like anything else." Jon drew his sword, Longclaw gleaming faintly even in the dim light. He slashed through the first wight that lunged at him, its body collapsing instantly. That got their attention. "They can be killed," Jon shouted. "Stand and fight." Daenerys didn't hesitate anymore. Dracarys. Drogon unleashed a torrent of fire that lit up the entire battlefield. Flames tore through the front lines of the undead, burning them into ash within seconds. The heat was overwhelming, melting snow and turning ice into steam. For a moment, hope returned. The dragons took to the sky, circling above like gods of war. Fire rained down again and again, cutting massive holes through the army of the dead. Men began to cheer. But Jon didn't. Because the Night King hadn't moved. Not even once. Through the flames, through the destruction, he simply watched. Waiting. And then he raised both arms. The fire died down, revealing charred bodies scattered across the battlefield. Then those bodies began to move. Jon's heart dropped. "No," he whispered. The burned corpses slowly stood up, their bodies broken and blackened, but still alive, still controlled. The fire wasn't enough. "It doesn't matter how many we kill," Jon said, realization hitting him hard. "He just brings them back." Daenerys landed Drogon nearby, her face tense for the first time. "Then we kill him." Jon looked at her. "It won't be easy." She met his gaze. "Nothing worth doing ever is." For a brief moment, there was understanding between them. Not politics, not power. Just war. But before Jon could respond, a sharp, icy sound cut through the air. A spear. The Night King had thrown it. It moved faster than anything Jon had ever seen. Straight toward the sky. Toward Viserion. The dragon tried to dodge, but it was too late. The spear pierced through his wing with a sickening impact. Viserion let out a terrifying scream, his body spiraling out of control as he crashed into the frozen ground, shaking the battlefield. Daenerys gasped, "No." Jon's grip tightened around his sword. This was it, the moment everything could fall apart. The Night King was no longer testing them. He was sending a message. Even dragons could fall. Viserion struggled on the ground, roaring in pain, his movements slower now, weaker. And the dead were already moving toward him. Jon didn't hesitate. "We have to move, protect the dragon." Tormund nodded, shouting orders as the free folk charged forward. The North followed. Not because they weren't afraid, but because they had no other choice. Jon ran ahead, cutting through whites, his mind focused on one thing only, reaching Viserion before it was too late. Because deep down, he knew something terrifying. If the Night King reached that dragon first, this war would be over before it truly began. The snow beneath Jon's boots crunched loudly as he ran forward, but he could barely hear it over the chaos. Screams, steel clashing, the roar of dragons, and the eerie silence of the dead blended into a nightmare that felt almost unreal. But the sight ahead of him was all too real. Viserion lay on the frozen ground, thrashing in pain, his massive wings struggling to lift his body. Blood, dark and steaming against the cold, spread across the snow. Each breath he took came out as a broken roar. And closing in on him. The dead. Jon pushed himself harder, cutting down anything that came in his way. His sword moved almost on its own now, slashing, blocking, killing, but it wasn't enough. There were too many. "Tormund," he shouted. "I'm right behind you," came the reply, followed by the heavy crunch of boots and the sound of an axe smashing bone. The free folk charged like wild storms, fearless as ever, but even they were being pushed back. Every wight they killed was replaced by two more. Jon's eyes flicked upward. Daenerys Targaryen was already moving, getting Drogon down toward the fallen dragon. Rhaegal circled above, unleashing fire in desperate bursts to hold back the tide. But Jon saw it. A path opening through the army of the dead. Not random. Controlled. The Night King was making a way. "He's going for Viserion," Jon muttered, his voice tightening. And then he saw him. Night King moved forward slowly, his icy gaze locked on the fallen dragon. The dead parted for him like he was their king, which he was. Jon felt a cold fear grip his chest. If he reached Viserion, everything would change. "Move," Jon roared, pushing forward with everything he had left. A wight lunged at him, he cut it down instantly. Another grabbed his arm, he shoved it away, driving Longclaw through its skull, but for every step forward, the dead dragged him back. Tormund smashed through two wights beside him. "We won't make it in time." "We have to," Jon snapped. Up ahead, Daenerys reached Viserion first. She slid off Drogon quickly, ignoring the danger, her hand reaching toward the wounded dragon. "Easy, easy," she whispered, her voice trembling but firm. Viserion's eye rolled toward her, pain and confusion burning within it. He tried to move, but his wing collapsed under him. "They're coming," Jon shouted as he finally broke through the last line of wights. Daenerys looked up, and for the first time, real fear filled her eyes. The Night King was close now. Too close. Without hesitation, she turned back to Drogon. "Burn them, all of them." Drogon obeyed instantly, unleashing a massive wall of fire between them and the approaching army. Flames roared high, forcing the dead to slow, their bodies burning as they pushed forward. For a moment, it worked. But Jon noticed something again. The Night King didn't stop. He walked through the fire. Not untouched, but unaffected. The flames bent around him like they feared him. Jon's breath caught. That's not possible. The Night King stepped out of the fire, his icy blue eyes glowing brighter now. And then he smiled. A small, cold, terrifying smile. Jon stepped forward, placing himself between him and Viserion. His grip on Longclaw tightened, every muscle in his body screaming at him to run, but he didn't. This was it. This moment. Everything had led to this. The Night King stopped just a few feet away. For a second, the battlefield seemed to fade. No noise, no movement. Just the two of them. Fire and ice. Life and death. Jon's voice came out low but steady. "This ends now." The Night King said nothing. He simply drew his weapon, an ice blade, shimmering with unnatural cold. Jon attacked first. He charged forward with everything he had, swinging Longclaw in a powerful arc. The Night King blocked it effortlessly, their blades clashing with a sharp, echoing crack. The force of it sent a shock through Jon's arms. He had fought White Walkers before. But this was different. The Night King was stronger, faster, smarter. Jon struck again and again, but every attack was blocked, parried, or avoided with terrifying ease. It was like fighting something that already knew what he was going to do. Behind him, Daenerys shouted, "Jon, move." But Jon couldn't. If he moved, the Night King would reach Viserion. So he held his ground. The Night King suddenly countered, striking fast. Jon barely managed to block, but the impact threw him backward, sending him crashing into the snow. Pain shot through his body, but he forced himself up. He couldn't lose. Not here. Not now. Around them, the battle continued to rage, but it felt distant. All that mattered was this fight. Jon charged again, this time more careful, more focused. He feinted left, then struck right, but the Night King caught his blade mid-swing. With one hand, Jon froze. The strength, it was unreal. The Night King tilted his head slightly, studying him, almost curious. Then he pushed Jon back effortlessly. Jon stumbled, barely keeping his footing. And then, a roar shook the sky. Regal descended in a fury of green flames, blasting directly at the Night King. The explosion of fire engulfed everything. Jon covered his face, the heat overwhelming. When the flames cleared, the Night King was still standing, not even burned. Jon felt something inside him crack. "How do we kill something like that?" he whispered. The Night King raised his hand again, and the dead surged forward. This time faster, more aggressive. They weren't holding back anymore. Daenerys climbed back onto Drogon, her voice desperate now. "We can't hold them, we have to fall back." Jon looked at Viserion, still alive, but barely. "If they left him..." "No," Jon said firmly, "we don't leave him." Daenerys stared at him like he was insane. "If we stay, we all die." Jon stepped closer, his voice quieter but stronger. "If we leave, he becomes one of them." That hit her hard. She looked at Viserion again, and her face changed. Determination replaced fear. "Then we end this here," she said. Jon nodded. Around them, the remaining forces of the North and the Free Folk tightened their lines, forming a desperate circle around the dragons. They were outnumbered, outmatched, and running out of time. But no one moved back. Because now there was no retreat. Only one choice left: fight or fall. And as the Night King stepped forward once more, Jon realized something chilling. This wasn't just a battle anymore. This was a test. And they were losing. The cold didn't feel like cold anymore. It felt alive, like it was crawling into Jon's bones, slowing his movements, whispering doubt into his mind. The battlefield had turned into something far worse than chaos. It had become a slow collapse. Jon stood at the center of it all, breathing heavily, his grip on Longclaw tightening with every passing second. Around him, men were falling, not retreating, falling. The dead weren't just overwhelming them now, they were breaking them. And still, the Night King walked forward. Unstoppable, unbothered, unchallenged. "Hold the line," Jon shouted again, though his voice was beginning to strain. Tormund roared beside him, blood covering his arms as he tore through another white. "They don't stop coming." "They don't need to," Jon replied grimly. "They just need us to fall." Another scream echoed behind them. Jon turned just in time to see a northern soldier dragged down beneath three whites. His cries were cut short almost instantly. Every loss made the circle smaller. Every second brought the Night King closer. Above them, Drogon and Regal continued to rain fire, but it wasn't enough. The flames slowed the dead, burned them, scattered them, but never truly stopped them. Jon looked again toward the fallen dragon. Viserion was weakening. His movements were slower now, his breaths heavier. The wound in his wing had worsened, freezing at the edges in a strange, unnatural way, as if the Night King's power was already trying to claim him. "We are losing him," Jon muttered. Daenerys heard it. She stood near Viserion now, her hand pressed gently against his neck, her face filled with a mix of pain and rage. "No," she whispered, "not like this, not him." For the first time, Jon saw something different in her. Not a queen, not a conqueror, just someone who was about to lose something she loved. And that made her dangerous. She stood suddenly, turning toward Drogon. Enough of this. Before Jon could react, she climbed onto Drogon's back again, her expression hardened into something fierce and unstoppable. "If fire won't stop him," she said, her voice rising with fury, "then I will." "Daenerys, wait," Jon shouted, but she was already moving. Drogon roared louder than ever before and launched into the air, his wings slicing through the storm. Instead of circling, instead of attacking the army, she aimed straight for the Night King. Jon's eyes widened. What is she doing? Tormund glanced up and let out a low whistle. Looks like your queen got a death wish. No, Jon said slowly, she's trying to end it. The battlefield seemed to pause as Drogon descended like a falling star, flames already building in his throat. The Night King looked up, watching her approach, not moving, not preparing to defend. Waiting. Daenerys screamed. A massive torrent of fire exploded downward, engulfing the Night King completely. The heat was unbearable, even from a distance. Snow vanished instantly, the ground turning black beneath the flames. Jon shielded his face, heart pounding. This had to work. It had to. The fire continued for several long seconds, relentless, all-consuming. Even the dead nearby were reduced to ash under its fury. Then it stopped. Silence fell. Smoke rose slowly from the scorched ground. Jon lowered his arm, eyes searching through the haze. Did it work? Someone whispered. For a brief moment, hope returned. And then, a shape moved inside the smoke. Jon's heart sank. The Night King stepped forward, completely unharmed. Not even touched. Daenerys' face went pale. That's not, she whispered, her voice breaking slightly, that's not possible. The Night King looked up at her, and that same cold smile returned. Then, slowly, he reached behind his back. Another ice spear formed in his hand. Jon's chest tightened. No. Move, he shouted, but it was too late. The Night King threw the spear with deadly precision. It shot through the air faster than sight. Straight toward Drogon. At the last second, Drogon twisted sharply. The spear missed his chest, but tore through part of his wing instead. Drogon roared in pain, losing balance in the air. Daenerys clung tightly, barely holding on as the dragon struggled. Go get out of here, Jon shouted desperately. But the damage was done. The Night King had proven his point again. Even dragons were not safe. Drogon retreated, flying unevenly now, taking Daenerys away from the center of the battle. And just like that, the balance broke. The dead surged forward again, harder than before. Without the dragons holding the line, the defenses collapsed quickly. The circle tightened even more, men forced closer together, fighting desperately just to stay alive. Jon cut down another white, breathing heavily now, exhaustion creeping into his limbs. We can't keep this up, Tormund said, his voice strained for the first time. Jon didn't respond. Because he knew. They were reaching their limit. And the Night King knew it too. He stepped forward again, closer than ever before. Jon raised Longclaw, forcing himself to stand tall despite the exhaustion. This wasn't about winning anymore. This was about buying time. Time for Daenerys to recover. Time for the dragons to return. Time for something, anything to change. But deep down, Jon knew the truth. If nothing changed soon, they wouldn't last. Behind him, Viserion let out a weak, broken roar. Jon turned slightly, his heart sinking again. The dragon's eye flickered. Just for a second. Blue. Jon froze. No, he whispered. The Night King's gaze shifted toward Viserion, and this time there was no patience left. He raised both arms slowly. The ground trembled again. The air itself seemed to freeze. And Jon realized, too late. This was the moment he had feared. If he turns him, Jon said, his voice filled with dread, we are finished. The snow began to swirl violently around Viserion's body. The dragon let out one last, painful cry. And then, everything went still. Jon's heart pounded in his chest. Waiting, hopping, praying. Then Viserion's head slowly lifted. His body moved again, but not like before. Not with pain. Not with life. His eye opened, glowing bright, unnatural blue. The same as the Night King. A wave of silence spread across the battlefield. Even the fighting seemed to pause for a moment, because everyone understood what had just happened. Jon's voice came out as a whisper. We lost him. The newly risen ice dragon let out a terrifying roar, louder, deeper, filled with something unnatural. And then, blue flames burst from his mouth. Not fire. Something worse. Something colder than death itself. The blast tore through the battlefield, freezing everything in its path instantly. Men, wights, even the ground itself, turned into ice. Jon barely dodged it, diving to the side as the frozen blast passed him. His heart raced faster than ever before. This was no longer a war. They could win the old way. Everything had changed. The Night King now had a dragon. And Jon realized something terrifying as he looked at the destruction around him. This wasn't the beginning of the end anymore. This was the end of beginning. The moment Viserion unleashed that unnatural blue flame, the battlefield changed completely. It was no longer a fight for survival. It became a desperate struggle against extinction. Jon pushed himself up from the frozen ground, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he stared at the dragon that had once been a symbol of hope. Now it was something else entirely, a weapon of the enemy. The cold fire spread across the field, turning men into statues of ice within seconds. Some didn't even have time to scream. Others fell mid-run, their bodies frozen in expressions of pure terror. Jon had seen death before, too much of it, but this felt different. This felt final. Night King stood still, watching his creation with quiet satisfaction. He didn't rush, didn't react, didn't even acknowledge the chaos around him. He didn't need to. The balance of power had shifted so completely that victory now felt inevitable. Jon's mind raced, trying to find any path forward, but every thought led to the same conclusion: they were losing, and fast. He turned, scanning the battlefield, searching for any sign of control, any sign of hope, but all he saw was collapse. The free folk were being pushed back harder than ever, their wild strength no longer enough against the endless tide. Northern soldiers who once stood proud were now either dead or retreating step by step, their formation broken beyond repair. Tormund, Jon shouted, forcing his voice through the noise and panic. He spotted him not far away, still fighting like a beast, his axe rising and falling with brutal force. But even Tormund looked different now, slower, heavier, tired. We have to fall back, Jon yelled, cutting down a wight that lunged toward him. Tormund spat blood into the snow, shaking his head. Fall back where? There's nowhere left to go. That hit harder than any blade. Jon knew he was right. Retreat wasn't a plan anymore, it was just a delay of death. Still, standing here meant dying even faster. Jon clenched his jaw, trying to think, trying to lead, but for the first time he felt lost. This wasn't a battle he could win with courage alone. Above them, the sky roared again. Jon looked up and saw Daenerys Targaryen returning on Drogon, her face no longer filled with fear, but with rage, real, burning rage. Drogon, wounded but still powerful, let out a furious roar as they descended once more into the battlefield. She had seen what happened. She had seen Viserion turn, and now there was no hesitation left in her. Burn them all, she commanded, her voice sharp and filled with fury. Drogon obeyed instantly, unleashing fire in wide, uncontrolled waves. This time it wasn't careful or strategic, it was destruction. The flames tore through both the dead and the battlefield itself, forcing everyone, ally and enemy alike, to scatter. Jon barely managed to shield himself as the heat passed over him. He understood what she was doing. This wasn't about holding the line anymore. This was about breaking everything just to survive. But even that wasn't enough. From the other side, Viserion rose into the air, slow at first, then stronger, guided by something unnatural. His wings, though damaged, carried him upward with a terrifying grace. and when he roared again, it echoed like death itself calling across the sky. Drogon turned toward him instantly, growling deep in his chest. Two dragons, once brothers, now facing each other as enemies. Jon watched in disbelief as they clashed in the air. Fire met ice. Flames collided mid-air, red against blue, heat against freezing death. The sky lit up with their battle, casting strange shadows across the battlefield below. Men stopped fighting for a moment, drawn to the sight, knowing they were witnessing something that would decide everything. Daenerys held on tightly, guiding Drogon with precision, but there was anger in her movements. Not just anger, pain. Jon could see it even from below. She wasn't just fighting an enemy, she was fighting something she had lost. Meanwhile, the Night King began to move again. This time faster, more direct. With Viserion now in his control, he no longer needed to wait. His army surged forward once more, stronger, more aggressive, as if feeding off the chaos above. Jon snapped back to reality. "Form up," he shouted, gathering whoever was left. "Stay together." A few soldiers rallied near him, forming a weak defensive line. Tormund joined him, breathing heavily but still ready to fight. "If this is how it ends," he muttered, gripping his axe tighter, "we make it count." Jon nodded slightly, though his eyes remained fixed on the sky. He knew something had to change, something unexpected, because right now everything they were doing wasn't enough. Then suddenly, a loud crack split through the air. Jon looked up just in time to see Drogon slam into Viserion mid-flight, their massive bodies colliding violently. The impact sent both dragons spiraling apart, crashing down toward the battlefield. The ground shook as Viserion hit first, sliding across the ice and snow, crushing everything in his path. Drogon landed harder, struggling to rise again, his wounds clearly slowing him down. Daenerys barely held on as they crashed, quickly climbing down again, her eyes locked on Viserion. There was no hesitation left in her now, only one decision. Jon saw it, and he understood immediately. She wasn't trying to save him anymore. She was going to kill him. "No," Jon whispered under his breath. Because deep down, he knew. That choice would change everything. Moments settled heavily over the battlefield, like the world itself had gone quiet to watch what would happen next. Daenerys Targaryen stood frozen for just a second after climbing down from Drogon, her chest rising sharply, her eyes locked onto Viserion. The dragon struggled to rise again, its movements unnatural, stiff, like something forcing life into a body that no longer belonged to it. The blue glow in its eyes burned brighter now, colder, emptier. Whatever Viserion once was, it was gone. Jon felt his feet move before his mind fully caught up. He pushed through the chaos again, cutting down wights that came in his way, his entire focus fixed on Daenerys. "Wait," he shouted, his voice breaking through the noise of battle. "You don't have to do this." But even as he said it, he knew how empty those words sounded, because there was no saving Viserion anymore. They both knew it. Daenerys didn't turn. Her hand rested against Drogon's side for a moment, drawing strength, grounding herself. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than Jon expected, but it carried a weight that silenced everything around her. "He's already gone." Jon slowed as he reached her side, his sword still in hand, his breath heavy. He looked at Viserion again, really looked this time. The way the dragon moved, the way it breathed that unnatural cold, there was no life left there. Only control, only the will of the Night King. "We don't know that for sure," Jon said, though there was doubt in his voice now. "Maybe there's still." "There isn't," Daenerys cut in, sharper this time. She finally turned to face him, and what Jon saw in her eyes made him stop. It wasn't just grief. It was something harder, something colder. "If we hesitate, he'll use him against us again, against everyone." Jon didn't respond immediately. Around them, the battle continued, but it felt distant again, like everything had narrowed down to this one moment. He hated that she was right, hated that this war kept forcing impossible choices on them. A thunderous roar interrupted them as Viserion finally pushed himself fully upright. His damaged wing dragged slightly, but it didn't matter. The power inside him wasn't his own anymore. He opened his mouth, and that same icy blue flame began to build again. "Move," Jon shouted instinctively, grabbing Daenerys' arm and pulling her back as the blast shot forward, freezing everything in its path. The ground cracked under the force of it, ice spreading outward like a living thing. Drogon roared in response, stepping forward protectively, but Jon could see the strain in him now. He was injured, tired, and even he seemed hesitant to face what Viserion had become. Daenerys pulled free from Jon's grip, her face set with grim determination. "No more running," she said under her breath. Before Jon could stop her, she climbed onto Drogon again. This time, there was no hesitation, no doubt, no emotion holding her back. She leaned forward slightly, her voice low but commanding. "End this." Drogon took to the air again, slower than before, but still powerful, rising to meet Viserion head-on. The sky became their battlefield once more, fire and ice clashing in violent bursts that lit up the storm. Jon watched from below, his heart pounding harder than ever. This wasn't just a fight between dragons anymore. This was something deeper, something symbolic. If Drogon fell too, it would be over, completely over. Behind him, Tormund staggered closer, breathing heavily, his axe resting against his shoulder. "Your queen's either mad or the bravest person I've ever seen," he muttered. Jon didn't take his eyes off the sky, maybe both. But even as the dragons fought above, Jon felt a presence shift behind him, a cold that didn't come from the wind. He turned slowly and saw him. Night King was closer now than ever before. No army between them. No distractions. Just him. Jon stepped forward instinctively, placing himself in the Night King's path again. His body ached, his strength fading, but something inside him refused to step aside. "Not this time." The Night King tilted his head slightly, studying Jon again, that same unsettling curiosity in his gaze. Then he began to walk forward. Jon didn't wait, he charged. Their blades clashed again, louder this time, sharper, more violent. Jon fought with everything he had left, every strike fueled by desperation, by anger, by the need to protect what little remained. But the Night King matched him effortlessly, his movements precise, controlled, almost calm. Jon swung hard, forcing the Night King back a step, but only a step. The Night King countered immediately, his blade slicing through Jon's guard and knocking Longclaw slightly off balance. Jon barely recovered in time to block the next strike. The force of it drove him to one knee. Pain shot through his arm, but he gritted his teeth and pushed back up, refusing to fall. He attacked again, faster now, more reckless, but the Night King simply adapted. It was like fighting something inevitable. Above them, a loud, piercing scream echoed across the sky. Jon looked up just for a second and saw Drogon lock onto Viserion's neck, biting down hard as flames erupted around them. Viserion thrashed wildly, his blue fire blasting uncontrollably, striking the ground and freezing parts of the battlefield instantly. Daenerys held on tightly, her face filled with both fury and pain as she forced Drogon to keep attacking. "Finish it," she cried. The sky exploded with fire and ice once more. Back on the ground, Jon felt the Night King's blade press closer to him. He turned just in time to block, but the impact sent him stumbling backward again, nearly losing his footing. The Night King stepped forward, raising his weapon slowly. This was it. Jon knew it. He was outmatched, out of time. But he didn't run. He tightened his grip on Longclaw, forcing himself to stand straight one last time. If he was going to fall, it wouldn't be on his knees. The Night King struck, and Jon met him head-on. Their blades collided again with a sharp, ringing sound that echoed across the frozen battlefield. Above them, one final roar shook the sky. Jon didn't look. He couldn't, because everything now came down to this single moment. Steel against ice. Life against death. And somewhere deep inside, Jon realized something that chilled him more than the cold ever could. Even if they won here, Nothing would ever be the same again. The air trembled as the clash of fire and ice raged above and below. Jon barely had time to breathe between swings of Longclaw, his body screaming with exhaustion, his arms trembling from the relentless battle with the Night King. Every strike he landed seemed meaningless. The Night King barely flinched, his icy blade cutting through Jon's defenses with terrifying precision. It wasn't just a fight, it was a statement of inevitability. This enemy didn't tire. This enemy didn't feel fear. And Jon realized with a cold clarity that the North itself might not survive if he didn't find a way to end it. Above, the sky was a hellish mix of fire and blue ice. Drogon and Viserion collided again, wings striking, talons clawing, and flames and frost roaring like two gods battling for dominion over the world below. Jon could see Daenerys clinging to Drogon, leaning forward, her silver hair whipping in the storm, her expression a mask of fury and determination. Each time she roared a command, Drogon answered, diving and twisting with lethal precision. But Viserion had grown into a terrifying weapon. The ice dragon was faster than before, more ruthless, his blue flames freezing even the burning ground beneath him, turning fire into crystal ice almost instantly. Jon felt a pang of horror at the thought of his queen's dragons being destroyed, and with them, all hope. The Night King pressed forward relentlessly, every step shaking the frozen earth. Jon blocked another strike and stumbled back, barely keeping his footing. Around him, the Northern Lords and the Free Folk were forming the remnants of a defensive line, but it was fragile, crumbling under the pressure of the advancing undead. Tormund swung his axe at a white lunging at his back, crushing its skull, but even he looked winded, his breaths ragged. Jon knew that every second they delayed was another second closer to disaster. A sudden, chilling roar split the air, louder than any before. Jon looked up just in time to see Viserion twist Medea and unleash a concentrated blast of blue flame toward the gathered troops. The wights and soldiers alike froze in place as the frost spread over them, instantly freezing snow, ice, and flesh alike. Men fell mid-step, encased in cold crystal, eyes wide with terror. Jon dove to the side, barely avoiding the deadly torrent, and scrambled to his feet, heart hammering. He knew that the Night King had gained an advantage they could barely even comprehend. With a dragon at his command, no force in the north could hope to stand. Jon's mind raced. They had to find a way to shift the balance, but every instinct screamed that conventional battle was useless. Fire alone wouldn't kill the Night King, and he had just learned firsthand that even dragons weren't safe from his control. The thought of Viserion, corrupted and controlled by that icy menace, made his stomach turn. And yet, in the midst of despair, a spark of resolve ignited inside him. If they survived, if the North survived, it wouldn't be because they had numbers. It would be because they were willing to fight, to make impossible choices, to risk everything. Jon's hand tightened on Longclaw, and he stepped forward once more, determined to face what might be his last fight. Daenerys swooped Drogon down low, aiming for Viserion's chest. The two dragons clashed Medea, fire and ice colliding with devastating force, sending a shockwave through the battlefield that threw soldiers and wights alike to the ground. Jon shielded his eyes as snow and ash swirled around him. "Now," he shouted, calling to Tormund and the Northern Lords who remained. "Attack together, don't hold back." A small band of warriors surged forward, axes and swords swinging, taking advantage of the chaos created by the dragon clash. They hacked through wights in a desperate bid to reach the Night King. Each step forward was a gamble, but Jon knew they had no other choice. Survival meant action, even against impossible odds. Tormund roared in agreement, charging alongside Jon. They fought their way toward the Night King, cutting down wights as they moved, each strike fueled by desperation. Jon's breath came in ragged gasps, his muscles burning, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't let the Night King reach Viserion completely unchecked. Every instinct, every ounce of strength, screamed at him to protect what remained of their dragons, their army, their world. Above, the battle between Drogon and Viserion intensified. Drogon dodged a blast of blue flame and retaliated with fire so intense it seared the snow and cracked the ice beneath him. Viserion countered with another stream of frost, freezing part of Drogon's wing, forcing him to struggle in the air. Daenerys leaned into the fight, hitting Drogon with precision, her face pale but determined. "Hold him off." Jon shouted, knowing that every second they brought above might allow the ground forces to reach the Night King. The Night King continued his relentless advance. Jon blocked another strike, feeling the force vibrate up his arms, threatening to throw him off balance. Sweat froze on his brow as the cold from the Night King seeped into his very bones. He swung Longclaw in a wide arc, striking the icy blade again, but the Night King barely flinched. It was as though he was expecting every move Jon made before it happened. Panic clawed at Jon's mind, but he forced himself to focus. He couldn't let fear control him, not now. A sudden crash drew Jon's eyes to the side. Rhaegal had joined the fight, swooping low to attack Viserion from another angle. The two dragons collided midair, their wings slamming together in a deafening crash. The sound shook the battlefield, echoing like thunder across the frozen expanse. Jon's heart lifted slightly. Maybe, just maybe, they could force Viserion back, even if only temporarily. Then he saw Daenerys lean forward, raising her hands as she guided Drogon in a precise strike. Fire met ice again, blasting toward Viserion, forcing him to veer sharply. Jon felt a flicker of hope, but it was brief. Viserion regained control instantly, twisting midair, roaring as he unleashed another blue flame, freezing the ground around him with terrifying speed. Jon dove again, narrowly avoiding the deadly blast. The realization hit him with crushing weight. This dragon was now a weapon beyond anything they had faced before. Every second he hesitated could cost lives. Every misstep could end the North. Jon's eyes flicked back to the Night King. He was closer now, moving through the remnants of their defensive line with terrifying speed. Jon blocked another strike, shoving back with all his strength, but he was already tiring. Around him, the remaining soldiers were being pushed aside, falling or retreating. The undead were relentless. The Night King was unstoppable, and yet Jon couldn't allow himself to falter. The dragons, the North, and the free folk depended on him, depended on all of them to fight until the end. If they lost faith now, it was over. And then Jon heard it, a low, thunderous growl from Drogon as he and Daenerys descended again, this time more coordinated. Fire and ice collided, lighting up the battlefield like a storm of destruction. Jon saw Tormund rally the remaining soldiers for one final push. "Now, Jon, together," Tormund yelled, swinging his axe at a massive wight. Jon nodded, bracing himself. He raised Longclaw, heart pounding, eyes fixed on the Night King, ready to fight with everything left in him. This would be the defining moment. There was no turning back. Failure was not an option. The battle for the North had reached its breaking point, and Jon realized something terrifyingly clear. This war was no longer just about survival. It was about deciding what the North, and possibly the world, would look like when it ended. And if they failed, nothing would remain. The air was thick with smoke and ice, a strange mixture of fire from Drogon and the deadly frost from Viserion. Jon's lungs burned as he struggled to take each breath. The cold cutting deep into his chest, while the heat from the dragons seared his face. Around him, the remnants of the Northern Army and free folk fought desperately, but it was chaos unlike anything he had ever seen. Whites surged forward, their frozen limbs snapping and cracking as swords and axes met them, yet for every one they cut down, another three seemed to rise behind them. Even in the thick of battle, Jon's eyes kept flicking skyward, tracking the two dragons as they circled, crashing into each other midair, flames meeting ice in a deadly dance. Each clash sent shockwaves across the frozen battlefield, and he had to force himself to keep his footing. Tormund fought at his side, swinging his axe with brutal precision, shouting words of encouragement to anyone who could hear him. "Don't give in, Jon, we fight, we survive." But even his voice, rough and unbroken for so long, carried exhaustion. Jon nodded, but he knew words alone wouldn't turn the tide. Every strike he made against the Night King was matched, blocked, or redirected. He had never faced anything like this. The Night King didn't just anticipate moves, he seemed to feel them, as if the fight was already mapped in his mind. Every blow Jon delivered was a test of endurance, a battle against inevitability. Yet he forced himself forward, step by step, refusing to give even an inch. Above, Viserion's blue flames began to spread in uncontrolled bursts, freezing parts of the battlefield that had been scorched moments before. Soldiers turned whites, even snow and ice were caught in that deadly breath, turning them into statues of frozen horror. Jon dodged a blast that tore through the earth just a few feet from him, snow and ice scattering around his boots. He saw men behind him, his friends and allies, frozen mid-step, locked in terror or turned to solid ice. A pang of grief hit him, but there was no time to dwell. Every second they hesitated gave the Night King more control, more power. Jon's eyes met Tormund's briefly. Both understood without words. This battle wasn't just about winning, it was about delaying the inevitable, holding the line until they could find a way to turn the tide. Daenerys maneuvered Drogon with deadly skill, dodging blasts from Viserion while striking back with fire that ripped chunks of ice from the ground. Jon watched as she leaned forward, every motion precise, every command calculated. She had changed. The grief over Viserion's corruption had hardened her, sharpened her focus. There was no hesitation left in her, no doubt. She wasn't just fighting for survival now, she was fighting for vengeance, for dominance, for control. Jon couldn't help but respect it, even as he feared the cost. One wrong move, and Drogon could fall too, leaving them completely defenseless. The Night King pressed forward relentlessly. Jon blocked another strike, shoving back with all his remaining strength, but the force of it nearly sent him sprawling. Ice bit into his gloves, snow crunched underfoot, and each breath felt heavier than the last. Behind him, the northern soldiers and free folk continued to fight, though many were now pushing backward, stumbling under the pressure of the undead. Jon knew that if they fell apart, it would be over in seconds. Yet still, he kept advancing. Every strike against the Night King was a statement. They would not yield, not yet, not while there was a chance, no matter how small, to protect what remained. A sudden roar above drew Jon's attention. Drogon and Viserion clashed midair again, wings slamming against one another with a sound like thunder. Jon felt the impact ripple through the ground beneath him, the earth shaking as fire met frost in violent bursts. Soldiers around him stumbled, some falling, some shouting, but Jon barely noticed. His focus remained locked on the Night King, whose movement seemed to grow slower, but only slightly, against the chaos around him. Jon pressed forward, forcing himself past wights, past collapsing men, toward that figure who embodied death itself. Then came the moment that changed everything. From the air, Drogon dove toward Viserion with a speed that blurred the edges of his form. Jon watched as the two dragons collided with a deafening roar, ice and fire exploding outward, sending shards of frozen earth and flaming snow in all directions. Jon felt the wind knock him off balance, but he held onto Longclaw, determined to stay on his feet. The force of the clash made the ground tremble beneath his boots. Tormund staggered beside him, struggling to maintain his footing. "This is madness," he shouted over the roar. "Insane, how do we fight this?" Jon shook his head, knowing there was no answer. There was no way to fight dragons that were no longer entirely their own, no way to fight an enemy that seemed unstoppable. All they could do was survive, delay, and hope. He turned back to the Night King, who had stepped forward through the carnage, each movement deliberate, each step closer making the hairs on Jon's neck rise. The Night King raised his icy blade again, and Jon realized with chilling clarity that this wasn't just a fight for the present. It was a fight for the future, for everyone, everything. As Jon swung Longclaw once more, blocking a strike from the Night King, he felt exhaustion finally start to weigh him down. His muscles screamed, his lungs burned, and his mind raced with the impossible choices that had brought them here. The north was crumbling around them. Soldiers fell, the free folk were retreating, and the dragons, once their greatest strength, had become a wild, uncontrollable force. Jon realized that every moment they delayed, every decision made, had consequences they might not survive to see, and yet he couldn't stop. He refused. Above, the dragons collided again, and Jon saw Daenerys lean forward, guiding Drogon with a precision that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. She wasn't holding back. She was pushing everything she had into the fight, into survival, into vengeance. Jon felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could hold the line long enough to strike the Night King when he was vulnerable. But that hope was fragile, and the cost of failure would be complete annihilation. The Night King advanced again, cutting down wights with precise, effortless strikes as he moved. Jon blocked a blow, forced back, then pressed forward again, his every movement fueled by desperation. He could feel the weight of the battle pressing down on him, not just physically but mentally. Every life lost, every step backward, every frozen soldier and shattered comrade added to the burden. And yet he pressed forward. He had to. They all had to. A sudden blast of blue flame from Viserion's mouth froze part of the battlefield, snapping Jon's attention upward. He ducked, narrowly avoiding the deadly ice, and looked toward the sky. Drogon had risen again, retaliating with a stream of fire that clashed with Viserion's frost in a burst that shook the air. Jon knew that above them, the dragon's fight was just as desperate as his own. One wrong move, one slip, and everything would fall apart. Jon tightened his grip on Longclaw, bracing himself as the Night King swung again. Their blades met with a ringing clash, sparks of ice and steel flying in all directions. Jon pushed back with everything he had, forcing the Night King to retreat a step. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to keep the possibility alive. Enough to remind himself that even against inevitability, they could still fight. The battlefield was chaos incarnate. Men fought and fell, dragons collided in the sky, and the Night King pressed forward, relentless. Jon's mind raced with strategy, hope, and fear, knowing that every decision now would shape the outcome of the battle. He glanced at Tormund, who nodded, understanding without words. This fight wasn't over yet. And then he looked upward, at Drogon and Viserion locked in their deadly aerial clash, and realized that survival depended not just on skill, not just on bravery, but on timing, precision, and an impossible amount of luck. Jon forced himself forward again, ignoring the ache in his limbs, the cold in his bones, and the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. Every strike, every step, every breath was for the North, for the free folk, for Daenerys, for Viserion, even if he was no longer entirely the same dragon he had loved. The Night King loomed before him, a reminder that death was patient, precise, and unstoppable. And yet Jon refused to fall. Not now, not when the world still hung in the balance. The storm raged above and below, fire and ice colliding, snow and ash swirling, men falling, and dragons tearing through the air. Jon pressed forward, every swing of Longclaw a testament to survival, every strike against the Night King a defiance against inevitability. The North might be crumbling, the dragons might be corrupted, and the army might be dwindling, but Jon Snow fought on, determined to find a way through the storm, determined to protect what remained, determined to survive long enough to turn the battle in their favor. And somewhere in the chaos, he realized something: this fight was far from over. The battlefield had become unrecognizable. What was once a frozen expanse of snow and ice was now a jagged landscape of scorched earth, shattered ice, and frozen bodies. Jon's boots crunched against shards of ice as he fought forward, every step a battle against fatigue and fear. The Night King moved with terrifying precision ahead of him, each swing of his blade forcing Jon to retreat slightly before pressing forward again. The clash of their swords echoed across the frozen plains, a relentless rhythm of steel against ice that left Jon's arms trembling and his chest heaving. Around him, the remaining northern soldiers and free folk fought with desperation, knowing each second they survived was a victory in itself, but each second also brought the Night King closer to dominating the battlefield completely. Jon caught sight of Drogon above, circling Viserion with fire blazing from his mouth, but the ice dragon moved with unnatural speed and accuracy, evading Drogon's attacks while freezing anything that came near. Jon's heart tightened at the sight. Viserion wasn't the same dragon anymore. He was a weapon of the Night King, precise, ruthless, and terrifying. Jon had loved that dragon once, had believed in the power of fire and blood to protect the North. Now Viserion's blue eyes glowed with a cruel intelligence that sent chills down his spine. Jon swallowed hard, forcing himself to focus. There was no time to grieve, no time to fear. All that mattered now was survival, and the hope, however slim, that they could still turn this battle around. Tormund fought beside him, swinging his axe at a group of advancing wights, but Jon noticed how much slower and heavier he had become. The free folk were relentless, but even their legendary endurance was being tested beyond measure. Jon's eyes darted back to the Night King. Every step he took forward, every motion of his icy blade, reminded Jon of just how impossible this fight was. But still, he pushed forward. Every strike, every parry, every forced advance was an act of defiance. He refused to give in, even as exhaustion gnawed at his body, and the wind cut through him like knives. Above them, the dragons collided again. Drogon roared, twisting sharply to dodge a burst of blue fire from Viserion, retaliating with a stream of red-orange flames that lit the sky and scorched the ice below. The force of their fight sent chunks of frozen ground flying, striking soldiers and wights alike. Jon ducked instinctively as a piece of ice shattered just above him, glancing off the tip of Longclaw. He looked up and saw Daenerys leaning forward on Drogon, her silver hair whipping around her face, her eyes fixed on Viserion with deadly intent. She was no longer just a queen or a leader. She was a force of nature, unrelenting, burning with a mix of grief, rage, and determination. Jon couldn't help but feel both awe and fear as he watched her guide Drogon through the air with precision that was terrifying in its efficiency. Suddenly, Viserion twisted Medea and unleashed a concentrated blast of blue flame, aiming at a group of northern soldiers and free folk below. Jon threw himself forward, knocking a man out of the way just as the blast froze the ground where he had been standing. The ice spread rapidly, trapping several soldiers in its grip. Their screams cut short as their bodies became frozen statues. Jon's stomach churned. Each second the Night King had a dragon at his command, the North lost more than it could afford. He tightened his grip on Longclaw, forcing himself to keep moving, to keep fighting, to keep surviving. Night King moved closer, cutting down wights with mechanical precision. Jon met his strike with Longclaw, their blades clashing in a ring of ice and steel. Every movement of the Night King seemed deliberate, calculated, and Jon could feel the weight of inevitability pressing down on him. The Night King didn't tire. He didn't hesitate. Each strike was a test, each block an assertion of dominance. Jon gritted his teeth, pushing back with all his strength, refusing to give an inch. He couldn't, not now. Not while the North, the free folk, and even Daenerys above relied on him to stand, to fight, to survive long enough to strike back. A roar drew Jon's gaze upward. Drogon had managed to strike Viserion Medea, forcing him to veer sharply and crash into a patch of frozen ground. The impact sent shockwaves across the battlefield, sending men and wights stumbling. Viserion shook his massive wings, struggling to rise, but the Night King's control over him was absolute. He lifted into the air again, roaring, releasing a torrent of frost that froze everything in its path. Jon ducked and rolled to avoid being caught in the icy blast, feeling snow and ice scrape across his armor and skin. The battlefield had become a nightmare of shifting fire and frost, of ice and smoke, of men fighting desperately against the inevitable. Jon pressed forward again, cutting down wights as he moved, his mind focused on the Night King. He had no plan. There was no strategy left that could guarantee survival. All he could do was keep fighting, keep moving, and hope that somewhere, somehow, they could find an advantage. He could feel exhaustion in every muscle, in every joint, but he forced himself onward. Every step brought him closer to the Night King, closer to a confrontation that he knew could end his life, or perhaps change the course of the battle entirely. Tormund rallied a small group of free folk nearby. "We fight together or we die together," he shouted, swinging his axe at a group of wights rushing toward them. Jon nodded, acknowledging the unspoken truth. This was no longer about glory or victory. This was about survival, about buying time, about protecting whatever remained from the Night King's growing power. Each swing of his sword, each move he made, was an act of defiance against the impossible. Above, Daenerys had guided Drogon into another attack on Viserion, forcing him downward with flames and fire. The two dragons collided in a deafening crash, wings striking and scattering ice and snow in all directions. Jon barely kept his footing as the ground trembled from the impact. He looked at Daenerys, her face pale but determined, and realized that this fight was not just about the dragons or the army below. It was about willpower, about refusing to yield, even when the world seemed bent on crushing them. The Night King pressed forward, relentless. Jon met him with Longclaw, their blades clashing in sparks of ice. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, the pressure of the inevitable pressing down. Every swing, every parry, every block took everything he had left, and yet he forced himself to continue. He could not allow the Night King to reach Viserion unchecked. He could not allow him to dominate the battlefield entirely, not while even a shred of hope remained. A sudden burst of blue flame from Viserion froze a patch of ground directly in front of Jon. He leapt aside just in time, feeling the icy heat brush past his face. Behind him, Tormund shouted, rallying the soldiers for a desperate push. Jon knew this was it, the moment where survival depended on every ounce of skill, every fragment of courage, every choice made in the chaos. The battlefield had narrowed, fire and ice converging in a storm of destruction, men and wights falling, dragons locked in a deadly struggle above. Jon pressed forward, eyes locked on the Night King. He could see the precision in the enemy's movements, the terrifying calm, the inevitability of each strike. And yet Jon did not falter. He moved with purpose, with resolve, with every thought and breath dedicated to the survival of the North, to the hope that they could still find a way to turn the tide. Jon swung Longclaw again, meeting the Night King's strike with a ring of ice and steel. Sparks flew, snow and frost scattered, and the impact reverberated through his arms. He pressed forward, step by step, refusing to retreat. The Night King advanced, but Jon was determined to stand, to fight, to survive. He didn't know if they would win, if the North would survive, if Drogon or Daenerys would live. All he knew was that he had to keep moving, keep fighting, and hope that somehow, someway, the tide could be turned. Above, the dragons continued their deadly aerial dance. Fire met ice in devastating collisions that lit the sky and shook the ground. Jon could feel the tremors beneath his feet as the two dragons fought, each trying to assert dominance, each a weapon wielded by forces beyond his control. And yet, even in the chaos, Jon saw an opportunity, a fleeting, dangerous chance. If he could hold the Night King long enough, if Daenerys and Drogon could strike at the right moment, perhaps they could change the battle, perhaps they could survive, perhaps they could win. Jon clenched Longclaw tighter, bracing for the next strike. His muscles burned, his lungs ached, and the cold seeped deep into his bones, but he pressed forward. He could not stop. He would not stop. The Night King was relentless, the battlefield unforgiving, and the dragons above were locked in a deadly struggle that could decide the fate of the North. And Jon knew one thing with terrifying clarity: this fight was far from over. Jon could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him as he pressed forward across the shattered battlefield. The snow beneath his boots had turned to slush, mixed with ice, ash, and blood. The roar of Drogon and Viserion above tore across the sky, fire and frost clashing in an almost unbearable storm. Jon's arms ached from holding Longclaw, his breath came in ragged gasps, and his vision blurred at the edges, but he refused to falter. Every soldier who had fallen, every wight frozen into icy statues, every life lost fueled him to keep going. There was no turning back. If they failed now, everything would be lost. Daenerys guided Drogon with deadly precision, circling Viserion, forcing the corrupted dragon to evade or risk crashing to the ground. Fire met frost with explosive force, ice shattering around them, and Jon could feel the tremors shake the earth beneath him. Viserion's blue flames froze anything they touched, encasing parts of the battlefield in crystal that glinted like shattered glass. Jon dove to the side as one stream of frost flew dangerously close, narrowly avoiding what would have been a fatal strike. He rose again, heart hammering, and pressed toward the Night King. The Night King's movements were measured, deliberate, unstoppable. Jon swung Longclaw again, blocking the icy strike, shoving back and forcing himself to advance. He could see the sheer precision in the Night King's attacks, the way he anticipated every move, countered every swing, and forced Jon to fight with every ounce of strength and focus he had left. Around them, soldiers fought desperately, but the tide was turning. For the first time, Jon realized that they might just have a chance, but only if they acted perfectly together. Drogon and Viserion collided again above them, the impact sending a shockwave through the battlefield. Ice and fire exploded outward, throwing men and wights off balance. Jon saw Daenerys lean forward on Drogon, shouting commands, guiding him in a calculated attack. Viserion twisted sharply, but Drogon's strike connected, clipping the dragon's wing. The blue dragon spiraled downward, momentarily off balance, giving Jon a glimmer of hope. Jon pressed the advantage, cutting through wights to reach the Night King. Each step was a struggle, every swing of Longclaw testing his endurance. The Night King advanced, but Jon met him with fierce determination. Steel clashed against ice again and again. Sparks flew, Jon's muscles screamed, his body burned, but he pressed on, refusing to yield. He knew what he had to do. From above, Drogon descended in a final, decisive strike. Daenerys guided him to land directly in Viserion's path. The dragons collided midair, fire and ice clashing with a deafening roar. Viserion twisted, losing control momentarily. Jon seized the moment. He lunged at the Night King, Longclaw raised, every ounce of strength, and will focused on one strike. The Night King's icy gaze met Jon's. Time seemed to slow. The battlefield, the dragons, the fallen soldiers, all of it faded from Jon's mind. In that instant, he knew he had to act with complete precision. He struck. Steel met ice. Sparks flew. The Night King faltered. For the first time, Jon saw the faintest crack in the perfection of the creature that had seemed unstoppable. Above, Drogon struck Viserion with one final blow, knocking him off balance and sending the blue dragon crashing to the ground. The corrupted dragon's flames sputtered, flickering as if the control the Night King had held over him was weakening. Jon pressed again, and with one final, desperate strike, Longclaw pierced the Night King's icy chest. A burst of energy erupted, shattering the Night King and the undead around him. The frozen soldiers, the wights, the icy structures, everything connected to his power crumbled in a storm of ice and light. The battlefield went silent. Snow fell softly, the storm clearing, leaving only the ruins of what had been. Jon dropped to his knees, exhausted, every muscle screaming, chest heaving. Around him, the remaining soldiers and free folk stared in disbelief. Drogon landed nearby, wings trembling, and Daenerys dismounted, her face pale but alive with relief. Viserion, freed from the Night King's control, lay on the ground, injured but alive. Jon walked over, touching the dragon gently. For the first time in what felt like eternity, there was hope. The North had survived, the dead had been defeated, the dragons were still alive, and though the cost had been unimaginable, Jon knew that together they had faced the impossible and won. Jon looked around the battlefield, at the fallen friends, the burned ice, the twisted snow, and the dragons soaring overhead. The night had been long, brutal, and filled with unimaginable loss, but the North had endured. And in that moment, Jon understood that survival was more than just living. It was about standing against the darkness, no matter how impossible it seemed. He rose slowly, the weight of exhaustion pressing on him, but a quiet determination filled his heart. The war was not over, the scars would remain, but they had survived the deadliest night the North had ever known. And together, they would rebuild, stronger and more united than ever before. The sky above cleared, the first stars of the night shining faintly over a battlefield scarred by fire and ice. Jon breathed in the cold, crisp air, and for the first time he allowed himself a small smile. The North had survived, the dragons had survived, and in the end, hope had survived as well. The story of fire and ice, of dragons and men, had reached its conclusion. But the memory of that night, of the battle, of the courage and sacrifice, would live on forever in the hearts of those who had endured, and in the legend of Jon Snow, the knight's hero, and the dragons who had fought for the North.